Okay, let's get started. So I greedily gobbled up your newest book, Antiviral Gut, over the weekend. And I really did gobble it up. Like it was, for like gut nerds like me, it was as page turner as it gets. And so I
Oh,
can't
thank you.
I can't wait for people to read this book because I really think it's going to change hearts and minds about how interconnected all of the systems of the body are. And I wanna make sure that we start folks off on a level playing field before we get into the really juicy, nerdy stuff. So, because we're talking about an antiviral gut, I feel like people are gonna be like, "Viruses, gut, like, what do the 2 things have to do with each other?" So maybe we should talk about, what is the immune system in the gut? Because you talk about how 70% of our immune system is actually in our gut, and I think that still might surprise a lot of people.
Absolutely. That's a great place to start. And I'll tell you, Desiree, when I was in medical school 30 years ago, I don't think I understood the immune system. I mean, the immune system is this really complex, it's not even one single organ, it's all these different cells and processes. And it seemed very diffuse and ethereal. And like, where is this thing anyway? And it really wasn't until about a decade or so ago, I've been a practicing physician for over 20 years, when I realized, oh, it's physically in the gut. So when we think about these immune cells, they are along the lining of the small intestine. And one of the really fascinating things is to realize that when something is in your gut, it's not actually in your body. It's in this hollow tube, 30 feet long, that runs the whole length of your body. And the things inside our gut are really the environment. It's, toxins we swallow, viruses, bacteria, it's food, it's both food that's partially digested as well as completely undigested. So all of that stuff is basically traveling through our bodies. And part of our digestive tract's mission is to process all of that stuff from the environment and then to selectively filter the nutrients through the gut lining, other things that we need, and keep everything else as debris, which, as we all know, then comes out the other end as stool. And so, it really is a remarkable thing that the immune system has to do. So the immune system is on the inside of the gut lining, and the trillions of microbes, our microbiome, are on the outside of the lining in the lumen. So again, outside our body. And our immune system has to sift through these literally gazillions of different bacteria, viruses, fungal organisms, etc., and figure out what's friend and what's foe. What does it react to? What does it ignore? How does it do all of that? And so the relationship between the gut microbes and the immune cells is really hand in glove. And literally, they are separated by a razor thin one cell membrane. That's all that's protecting you from the environment. And there's constant interaction. And so a couple examples: when certain viruses are present in that sort of morass of stuff moving through the gut, there's a common gut bacteria called Bacteroidetes, is a class, and that signals specific cells in the intestinal lining to react, and they release something called interferons. And I love the name interferons. They're called interferons because they interfere with viruses. So the interferons get released, and then that triggers a whole other series of essentially an immune cascade. But it starts with the Bacteroidetes. So then you start to see, if your microbiome is imbalanced, sort of messed up, and you don't have the right gut bacteria to, sort of launch that heat-seeking missile of the interferons, the whole thing is potentially going to be occurring haphazardly. But it is almost, again, like that air traffic control. If you think of the immune cells as airplanes and the bacteria telling them, okay, you stay up in the air, now you land, now you take off quickly. So same thing, they're saying, okay, this pathogen is really serious. Here comes Ebola, time to react. This thing, benign, harmless, don't react at all, stand down. And so again, in medical school, I just didn't appreciate the complexity, but also the intimacy of the relationship. And I don't think anybody did really, because, as even though we've known about these microbes since the 1600s, when that Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek looked at his dental plaque under the microscope and saw a whole bunch of bacteria, it really has taken us centuries to figure out that most of these microbes are friends rather than foe, and that they are very invested in our survival, because when we die, they die. They want to keep us alive. So that gut immune connection is a physical relationship with the microbes and the immune cells, literally separated by one cell membrane, constantly interacting. And then there's another really important aspect of that relationship, and that is that gut bacteria ferment indigestible plant fiber. And I know this is where you and I strongly intersect on the eat more fiber. So the gut bacteria ferment the fiber and produce something called short chain fatty acids. So those would be things like butyrate, propionate, et cetera. And these short chain fatty acids are really essential for what we call immune balance, for preventing an overblown immune response or an immune response that's not active enough to clear virus. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this latest pandemic and tragic is that so many of the deaths were a result of this overblown immune response, things like cytokine storm, where the immune response was so overwhelming that it basically destroyed normal tissue. So short chain fatty acids produced by the gut bacteria are really pivotal for creating what I like to call a Goldilocks immune response, just right.
Yeah. I love it. There is so many layers to unpack there. And I want to start by just, it's really a paradigm shift, because I think most of us, when we think about our gut, we think about our gut as being inside of us, like the same way our heart is inside of us, or the same way like our bones are inside of us. And when you really think of it as like a tunnel through your body, then it starts to make so much sense that like your immune system needs to be there, instead of building your walls out of wood or concrete, really you're building them out of tissue paper. So of course you're going to
Absolutely.
need like a lot of barriers to ensure that that tissue paper stays intact, because it would be so easy to break through it otherwise. And I've sort of been watching as, the last couple of years, all of these papers have been coming out in the moment about COVID. And, there was one that really stuck out about people who were eating vegan diets and their susceptibility to severe disease. And, when I think about COVID in the gut, the other thing that I've really noticed over the last couple of years is people saying, I had COVID and my gut is messed up. And in your book, you talk about how viruses bind to specific receptors, and that the SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to ACE2 receptors in the lungs and the gut. And we think of COVID as like an upper respiratory. We think about this as like, in our lungs, in our sinuses, in our nasal cavity, but not in the gut. Like, what is COVID actually doing to our guts? Like, what do we know about it so far?
Well, we know from the early studies from Wuhan and others that 60% of patients infected with COVID had GI symptoms. 60%, the majority. They had diarrhea, they had nausea, they had abdominal pain. And ACE2 receptors, those receptors that you described so beautifully, are more plentiful in the gut along the intestinal epithelial lining, that same gut lining, one cell
That
thick.
tissue paper lining.
They're tissue paper lining. They are, I often refer to it as a strainer, but I like the tissue paper. I feel like that's, that is probably a more accurate description of the fragility of it. And so we know that the GI symptoms are really common. We know that the ACE2 receptors are actually more plentiful in the intestines than they are in the lungs. And so that is, and we also were just chatting a minute ago about how the GI tract is open to the environment. And so how does SARS-CoV-2 get into our bodies for many of us? Well, it can get in through the airway, but it can also get in through the mouth. And so it enters through the digestive tract, binds to those receptors, infects intestinal epithelial cells. And that's why then with that infection can come additional secretion, diarrhea, et cetera. And it can also create changes in the microbiome because ACE2 receptors are not specific for SARS-CoV-2. They're also involved in a lot of other kidney function, et cetera. And they're also involved in homeostasis of the microbiome, in keeping the microbiome sort of balanced and healthy. And so what I find this one of the most interesting aspects of the disease is that if we look at people who do poorly after infection with COVID-19, with SARS-CoV-2, or people with long COVID, we often recognize that they have dysbiosis as an underlying condition, which is an abnormal microbiome, an imbalanced microbiome, typically overrepresentation of some species that are the kind of less desirable ones and underrepresentation of other species. And one of the really important landmark studies pointed to Faecalibacterium prosnitzii, my absolutely favorite bacterium, F. prosnitzii for short, the most prevalent bacteria in plant eaters, regardless of whether you call yourself a vegan, whatever it is. If you are a good plant eater, you have high F. prosnitzii. And if you have high F. prosnitzii, you are going to have a better outcome after infection with COVID. So we know this for a fact, that high levels are associated with better outcomes. Low levels are associated with respiratory distress, ICU, ventilation, death, etc. So knowing that, we start to see, okay, well, how do you build high F. prosnitzii? Well, you eat a lot of fiber, and you start to see the interconnectedness of it, as you said. And you start to see also that although the processes seem complex, at the end of the day, these bodily systems are fairly simple, and the things they need to function properly are fairly simple. They need rest, they need water, they need movement, they need fresh air, they need fiber, really, really basic. And, I think really looking, my previous books were about digestive health, a subject I know really well, having been a gastroenterologist now for almost 3 decades. But the issue of virology and immunology, first of all, is moving really fast. I literally, read 4 or 5 papers, go to bed, I'd get up the next morning, there'd be 3 or 4 new studies in the same area, showing additional things. So things are moving really fast, but some of these things are really not that new. Like, we know that a microbially rich environment is one that is more resilient and will do better. But the data about SARS-CoV-2, the GI symptoms, was surprising because, as you said, people think of this as a respiratory illness. And the early studies showed the majority. Later studies showed maybe fewer people, but also people don't report the GI symptoms as often. And we know, for example, that the virus is present, it's shed in the stool, and we can detect it in the stool for longer than we can detect it in the respiratory secretions and earlier. So some universities early on in the pandemic had innovative ways of tracking outbreaks, of looking at testing the sewage from different dormitories, et cetera, to see when that was rising. And that usually preceded the respiratory symptoms and students coming in and getting tested. So it really, it's a treasure. People think of stool as, it's waste and it's yucky. And, this stuff is so valuable for what it can tell us.
Well, and that fits perfectly with that, like, one person's trash is another person's treasure. So it's like, your trash is a scientist's treasure. That just, I love science so much. But just what you said right there, think about the incredible nature of how we know what we know. We're like, maybe actually, since we know that this virus is shed in stool, we could test the sewage and see what's happening in our population. Like, what is the viral load in our sewage? And that will tell us something. Even if people are not self-reporting their disease, that's going to tell us something about what's happening in our community. That's mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, it really is. And when we think about all the different information we get from stool, think about it. Your microbiome is a more unique identifier of you than your own DNA. It reflects everything, where you've lived, whether you were born vaginally or C-section, whether you were nursed, what you've eaten, medications, even the stress in your life. So we think about, our genes and genetic information as being so valuable, but as it turns out, the genes are probably just a suggestion. It's really these epigenetic factors of diet and environment, et cetera, which are very well reflected in our microbiome, that are really the determinants of whether disease gets expressed or not, or when disease occurs, how severe it is. And when I would watch stuff on television, and every person who lost life, who lost livelihood, who lost loved ones, is tragic. And I would watch these reports on television and think, what this family must be going through. But I would also think, why are we not following these breadcrumbs backward and understanding? And if you look at that first report of the incredibly high death rate in New York City with the sort of first wave of the pandemic, we saw from those early reports that 76% of those patients had comorbidities. And those comorbidities are all related to disruption in the microbiome, things like having obesity and being hypertensive and diabetic, et cetera. So these are all diseases that in large part are created as a result of, there are other factors too, But in large part, the contribution of a disrupted microbiome is key, particularly for a disease like diabetes. So, again, we can read the tea leaves and follow the breadcrumbs backward and understand why people who have these diseases are having such poor outcomes, and also why these diseases are developing. And then, of course, the next piece is to create more public health awareness around this, which I think has been a little bit lacking, to be honest.
Yeah. And, I think that idea of really searching for the why is something we're not good at. We're like, here's the what, here's what we're going to do about it, but we don't ask why enough. And I think particularly with the idea of the microbiome, it's such a household word now, but it also still seems fairly ephemeral. Again, almost like you said early with your immune education, you're like, but where is it? Like what exactly? And what is exactly is the impact of the microbiome on all of these other outcomes in terms of our health? And so, like, let's talk a little bit more about good microbes, because in your book, you mentioned Antoine Béchamp's terrain theory and this idea. We had the germ theory that was this idea that, like, oh, these tiny little things cause disease. But then there was this other theory, the idea that if you have a healthy soil, you can deter infection with these microbes, and that actually might be more predictive of your disease outcome than like heart disease or having obesity, for example.
Yeah. And again, when you think about it in really plain terms, so think about an 85-year-old who is a smoker and sedentary and overweight and has high blood pressure and heart disease, who has a stroke, and what sort of outcome he's going to have compared to his 20-year-old grandson who's a triathlete and eats a ton of plants and has never smoked and has no diseases, right? I mean, it's intuitive. The other one, soil, because as a result of age and habits and so on, has healthier soil. He has a stroke, he's going to do much better. So for every single disease state, whether it's infection, cancer, metabolic diseases, whatever it is, heart disease, neurological disease, if you are a healthier person, I mean, I think in the past we would have talked about protoplasm and without really having a sense of what that is, right? But if you are a healthier person, by whatever parameters you use to measure that, chances are you are going to have a better outcome. And that, age is one of those parameters, one of those we can't control, but we see that younger people in general, not always, tend to do better. And there are some really obvious reasons, like the immune system is waxing in the very young and waning in the very old. So we are less sort of immunologically robust. And that's actually good and bad news. I mean, it's bad news because as we get older, and we see this more in the over 65 population, they don't mount as strong an immune response to vaccines, et cetera. They're not able to fend off a virus as well. But when you have autoimmune diseases, which is by definition a hyperactive immune system, as you get older, these autoimmune diseases tend to go into remission more easily and sometimes on their own spontaneously. So it's not all bad news in terms of as we get older. But so we see examples of this all the time in terms of, who survives a motor vehicle accident. I have a patient who, she's in her mid-20s now, and I've known her since high school. And she was in a terrible car accident about 4 years ago that literally she's lucky to have survived. And she had a ruptured spleen, and they had to take her gallbladder out, and they had to remove intestines. I mean, she was so, in fact, she did die. She had a cardiac arrest with her mother right there in the room, and they resuscitated her. And she's in law school now, and you should see her. She looks amazing. And I look at her and I'm like, if you had been, if this had been your mother, she probably wouldn't be here. So the ability for the body to sort of regenerate and recover is very much tied to these markers of health. But it's not just age, because we see that older people can have less frailty and can be extremely healthy if their microbiome is healthy. And all these comorbidities that we think of as related to age, the alphabet soup of HTN and CHF and, heart failure, hypertension, diabetes, all these things. Again, we see foundationally this disruption in the microbiome as a major risk factor. And again, other epigenetic factors, right? The food you eat, whether you smoke or not, other environmental factors, they can be genetic factors. But it is turning out that the microbiome is this whole new frontier in medicine. And it's one I'm so optimistic and excited about because unlike our genes, which are much more static, we have an incredible amount of control over what's going on with our gut bacteria by our habits and our diet. And so, there was a really famous study that was published in the journal Nature in 2014, and that showed that within about 30 hours of food hitting the gut, they could see significant changes in the microbiome. And this is a study where they initially put, I know you're familiar with this one, they initially put the volunteers on a sort of Atkins type, pork rinds and prosciutto diet. And then they rested them for about 5 days and put them on a plant-based diet, jasmine rice, lentils, mango for snack instead of pork rinds. And they saw that the microbes changed dramatically. The biophilia, the microbes that are involved in breaking down animal protein, decreased, but they're also associated with inflammation. But the genes changed too. And that was a really exciting thing about that study is they weren't just, microbial changes they expected. They didn't expect them that quickly. And they didn't expect them to be that profound. But the fact that they were seeing different genes turned on and off based on the microbial changes was really surprising. And so to me as a physician, like what great news, right? Like, okay, everybody in your family died of heart disease, but guess what? That is not necessarily your destiny.
Well, and it's such an opportunity. And I think so often, particularly when people look at the statistics about how we're living today, is that, no one's eating enough fruits and vegetables. No one's eating enough fiber. Diabetes is rampant. We have so many chronic conditions that it is more normal in our society here in North America to have at least one of these chronic conditions than it is to not. And I think we can think about, oh, well, like it must just be our genes and I can't do anything about our genes. But this idea of epigenetics, that your environment, your inputs can flip the switch, right? It can turn it on or off. Do you eat the vegetables? Do you eat a lot of meat? Do you have the kind of microbiome that's going to send those positive messages? Is such an incredible opportunity because we can actually do very real things to change it. And you talked about in your book that there were really sort of like in terms of building a good terrain, there were kind of like three main factors that you could focus on. So fiber, one of them, our favorite thing, probiotics, which not all gastroenterologists have a positive opinion of. So I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that. And then exposure to dirt. So like, how do these things go together?
Well, let's start with the fiber. The fiber, is key. Again, we talked about the bacteria fermenting fiber to short-chain fatty acids, and short-chain fatty acids being important, not just for the immune response, but for maintaining the integrity of that gut lining, making sure that tissue paper doesn't collapse or tear. So fiber is essential. When I talk about probiotics, remember by definition, probiotics refer not just to something you take externally, but to the live bacteria in your gut. And I will be the first to tell you that the actual bacteria living in your gut are far more important and relevant than any store-bought probiotics you can take. We do have, and so I'm not an advocate of the average person taking a probiotic. I do use specific probiotics in my practice that have a lot of science behind them. One of the ones I use for my patients with inflammatory bowel disease is considered a medical food by the FDA and has over 100 different studies behind it in humans. And that's something that I use at high dose, prescription strength in specific situations, traveler's diarrhea, IBS, pouchitis, etc. But for the average person looking to get healthy, I'm like, listen, this is what I want you to do. Go to the farmer's market, buy some apples, buy some sauerkraut, make sure the apples have dirt on them. You can wash it off before you eat them, but make sure these were grown in soil, that these are not industrial organic, grown in some warehouse. And I want you to eat that. So again, feeding our native population of bacteria. We all have Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. We have it in varying degrees. So encouraging the growth of your native F. prausnitzii by eating more fiber is by far a more rational approach to developing a healthy microbiome than continuing to eat cheeseburgers and Cheetos and then taking some store-bought F. prausnitzii, right?
Darn
That's
it.
just, that's what we call magical thinking. And so, and again, it's like a lot of these things, it's less about something you're doing that's not great and more about something that you might be missing when it comes to the diet. And we were chatting earlier about if you're toxing 80% of the time, you might need to detox. But if 80% of the time you're eating a reasonable diet, you're, getting to bed on time, you're doing things that are easily done and clearly good for you, then you don't need to be doing these radical detoxes, cleanses, etc. So it is, again, I marvel at how it's not super complicated. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of commerce involved in medicine right now. And I feel like I would be remiss not to mention that. And while I'm a huge advocate for the fact that we have these amazing drugs, we have antibiotics, we have biologics, we have, immunosuppressive drugs that can be life-changing and life-saving for people with complex autoimmune disorders. And I myself prescribe these drugs when needed, but the key word here really is judicious, right? Judicious prescribing, judicious use. And so what I've seen in my career over the last couple of decades is these drugs go from being, okay, well, everything else fails, and now we need this, to being first line with no discussion of diet or lifestyle. And in my practice, where I treat primarily people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, we have about almost an 80%, we have about a 77% remission rate with using diet and lifestyle. And guess what? Like, that doesn't cause cancer or serious infection like these drugs do. So we do have, I would say somewhere between 20, 25% of our patients do need more potent medications. And again, I'm thrilled that we have them, but we're always trying to sort of march up that pyramid, right? Start with the basics. Like, let's take a really careful look at diet and lifestyle. Are you sleeping? What does your stress response look like? What are you eating? All of these things. Are you getting outside in nature? And then work our way up with the most basic medication that usually is not as efficacious, but hey, if it works and it's, it's going to have much fewer side effects. So we call that bottom up. But a couple of decades ago, we saw a big shift in the pharmaceutical industry where they said, no, we're going to go top down, and, came up with all these different rationales that, well, if you get the disease into remission faster, you have fewer complications. And there are studies that bear that out. But at the same time, we're talking about drugs that can cause cancer, serious infection, and death. And, particularly these are diseases that tend to strike young people. So if I'm 20 years old and I'm diagnosed with Crohn's, I would probably want to give this stuff a go before committing to a drug for the rest of my life that is so fraught with side effects. So I think, unfortunately, we're just seeing this sort of quick, let's just use this without a lot of thought about what else can be done. And the truth is, Desiree, a lot of gastroenterologists are unaware of the role of diet and lifestyle for GI diseases because it's not part of their training. It's not something they've experienced. They're used to doing procedures and prescribing. Mm-hmm. So that's where I think people like you come in, and others who do really the heavy lifting of helping people with diet and lifestyle change, and these things that are often more profound in the effects they have, and at the very least complementary to what you're doing with medication.
Well, and it's what I value about your approach so much is that, we just have this tendency these days towards these extremes of opinion. And to hear you say, no, these medications can save lives, they can make people better, but it's not one or the other. And, after like a decade in digestive health practice myself, it's the same thing. Like, I would see people and they're on their biologics, but they still have upwards of, 24 bowel movements a day. And everything's going right through them. So they have chronic fatigue and, like, you just watch these things pile up, and it's like, well, if the best of medicine we have, we're throwing the best of medicine at them, why aren't we also talking about nutrition? Why aren't we also talking about and watching people improve, that both are like they're partners in care, as opposed to, things that you do either or. And I just really value that about you. And I want to maybe shift to this idea of judicious use of medications, because something I'm really passionate about in our practice is the prescription of proton pump inhibitors. And when I saw you talking about it in your book, I was like, yes, because let's start from the basics, because we hear, like, in wellness, we sort of talk about stomach acid, but I think the average person doesn't think about stomach acid unless they're refluxing. But stomach acid is actually a really important part of how your digestive system was designed. Like, what does stomach acid do for us?
Yeah, this is literally my favorite topic to talk about because it is, I think, so poorly understood. And because proton pump inhibitors, those very potent drugs that completely block stomach acid, are among still the most commonly prescribed drugs in the world. And part of why they're so popular is because they work really well. And so they take away that negative feedback loop that happens when acid is coming up. But let's start from the very beginning. So stomach acid is important for three really important reasons. The first is digestion. The different enzymes that your pancreas is releasing and other digestive organs can't work properly if the milieu is not acidic. So if you have shut down the proton potassium ATPase, that proton pump, and you don't have stomach acid, which is what these drugs do so beautifully, then those enzymes are not going to be effective. And certain different nutrients that you absorb, for example, B12, can only be absorbed in an acidic milieu, the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So you interfere right away with the absorption and assimilation of nutrients. And so if you have blocked your stomach acid, regardless of whether you're eating a super healthy diet, your assimilation and absorption of nutrients is not going to be normal. And so that's why when we look at some of these population-based studies of acid blockers, we see such far-reaching effects, like these drugs potentially contribute to dementia, they cause kidney problems, they can cause heart disease, they affect our bones, increase fracture risk. Like, what's going on? Well, what's going on, again, is your GI tract is in the center of your body. It's the engine for your entire body. And all these different organs rely on the nutrients coming from your gut. But if your gut now, if digestion is broken because acid is so fundamental to digestion and now you don't have any stomach acid, this delivery of nutrients is compromised. And therefore, these distant organs are compromised. And so in 2020, in summer 2020, there was a population-based study that looked at, so number one, digestion. Number two, protection from pathogens. And so this is where I'm going with this study. There was a study in summer of 2020, and this study was a pivotal moment where I was like, okay, I have to write a book and talk about this. The study came out looking at 54,000 patients, asking the simple question, if you're on a proton pump inhibitor, are you more likely to get COVID? Now, for me as a practicing gastroenterologist, it's like, of course, we know that any of these infections that infect the gut, stomach acid denatures them, destroys them. So we see increased rates of enteric infections, as we call them, infections that can affect the gut, like Campylobacter, like E. coli, like Clostridium difficile, like norovirus, rotavirus, so viral and bacterial in people taking acid blockers. So well before COVID, if there was a viral outbreak on a cruise ship, you could pretty much predict, okay, the people taking the acid blockers, they're going to become infected. So we know that exposure alone isn't responsible for illness, and that it's these host factors that can determine who doesn't get infected at all after exposure, who has mild symptoms or is asymptomatic, or who has a poor outcome. And we've known that not having stomach acid is associated with that worst group because you can't denature viral proteins. So this study came out, and I said to my husband, who's not in medicine, he's cyber security, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, I have to shoot you to tell you more kind of field. And I said, you know that not having stomach acid doubles your risk for COVID, right? The study showed taking it once a day doubled your risk. Taking these drugs twice a day led to a 3 to 4-fold increase. And he looked at me, he was like, what? I said, right, because not having stomach acid. And he goes, no, I don't know that. So then I started asking some of my medical colleagues who weren't in gastroenterology. They were also surprised. And then, Desiree, I asked a couple of GI colleagues, and they also didn't know. And I was like, what? Okay, so if my medical colleagues, even some of my GI colleagues, are not aware of this, what is the likelihood that the general public is aware? And the book started out as a conversation with my literary agent, who's been with me for this book number 4 through all the others. And he said, well, maybe you should write an editorial. And I was sort of working on that. And then another study came out, the one we talked about, showing that analysis of the microbiome is predictive of outcome with 92% accuracy. That study with a high F. prosnitzii, which is way more accurate than all the other indicators combined: comorbidities, age, gender, inflammatory markers in the blood. So I had these two pieces of information, and I'm like, these two pieces of information themselves, just on their own, are really essential for people to know about. But then there was so much more. So I said, okay, it's time for another book. But so we have number one, digestion 101, acid. Number two, protection against pathogens, not just viruses, but also different sorts of pathogenic bacteria. And number three, maintaining the gradient of gut bacteria throughout the gut. So as we go from north to south down our digestive superhighway, we have a lot less bacteria in the upper GI tract, in the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, etc. And as we travel down and we get down to the colon, the amount of bacteria increases dramatically, because that's where all the fermentation happens. But when you block stomach acid, you allow overgrowth in the upper GI tract, and you completely mess up that gradient. And one of our GI studies, published about 8 or 9 years ago in a journal called Gut, showed that people who were taking proton pump inhibitors chronically for more than a few months at a time, that messes up their microbiome in a way that's equivalent to taking antibiotics, to taking long-term antibiotics, because it completely, like, they were finding mouth anaerobes in the rectum. Like, mouth anaerobes are not supposed to be in the rectum. And again, these bacteria are supposed to be in certain places because they have different jobs to do. And that natural pH gradient helps to maintain that. So this was, completely disrupted. And then the thing I like to point out to people, because the marketing around these drugs makes you think that you have overproduction of stomach acid. Overproduction of stomach acid is a really rare condition called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. It occurs in 1 in a million people in North America. So in the US, that means about 350 people walking around with it. And the only reason I've ever seen it is when I was full-time faculty at Georgetown, we had a dual appointment to the National Institutes of Health. And we covered clinical building 10, which is part of the digestive diseases and kidney group, and all the rare diseases were there. We'd get a call in the middle of the night. We have a patient with Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome who's on clinical protocol number 5F7UT5, and they're bleeding from their nose, mouth, and rectum. And we'd be like, ah! So they had, NIH is, I have to give a shout out to NIH and say that it is incredible. They provide free care to people with all these rare and unusual disorders. They do an incredible amount of research, and, NIH should never go away. It is such an incredibly important organization. But they have a clinic, a ZE clinic, Zollinger-Ellison clinic. And so most gastroenterologists will never see a patient with ZE in their career. But I saw ZE patients because we covered NIH. So that's who has overproduction. Everybody else, other, however million people who have heartburn, what they have is inappropriate relaxation of that lower esophageal sphincter, that tight muscle between the esophagus and the stomach that's supposed to, after you swallow, it's supposed to close tight and keep the contents in the stomach. But what happens? We eat a larger meal than we probably should be, so that opens up the sphincter. We eat a high-fat meal that takes longer to digest. That tends to open up the sphincter. We eat late at night when the stomach contractility is really low. That opens up the sphincter. We drink alcohol or caffeine. That opens up the sphincter. We smoke. That opens up the sphincter. Is even certain medications. So we are mostly overwhelming the capacity of the stomach, which is really about the size of a closed fist. That's about how much. And that is, in particular, if you're eating more than a fistful late at night when the GI tract is not active, you're almost certain to get reflux. And you can induce it. You eat something greasy, especially something cheesy after midnight, and you eat enough of it, you will have reflux, regardless of whether you typically have that or not. Most people will. So we see that, that people who have these symptoms, when you take the drug, you feel great because now you can eat that cheesy cheeseburger or whatever it was late at night and you feel fine and you can eat a large meal. But that sphincter is still open and acid is still coming up, but it's just neutralized now. But the point of the heartburn, again, it's this important negative feedback. It's like a hangover if you drink too much, or a sore muscle if you overdo it. It's designed to make you sort of pull back and change your behavior. So not having that feedback. And as you know, in the book, I open that chapter by saying, like, imagine if you didn't get a hangover, like how many people would die of alcohol poisoning? I mean, if you could just drink and drink and drink, or, again, the pull muscle analogy. So these positive and negative feedback loops are really important for keeping us safe and keeping us healthy. And so one of the things that we see, in addition to when we block stomach acid, all the other things like the vulnerability to pathogens and the interruption of digestion, etc., it also removes that inhibition that then allows us to kind of overwhelm our GI tract with too much food too late at night, etc.
Yeah. All of the while that you were talking, there were just fireworks going off in my head because we would see so many clients in practice who, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Chutkan, but my understanding is of these drugs is they were really meant for short-term use. And we would see clients on them for 5 years, 10 years, still coming to us with symptoms of reflux. And where I am, there was data from the University of British Columbia that showed between 2000 and 2018 that prescriptions for PPIs had increased by 440%. And we're a really small province of about 4 million or so people. There's no way our population increased by even 100% over that time. So clearly, like, we're just using these medications in the way that is not really patient-centered, not really asking why are we having these symptoms in the first place, and certainly not like in the best interest of our health over time.
Well, you're absolutely right about those numbers, and also about the indications, and not just when they first came out, still the indications for proton pump inhibitors for long-term use are very limited. So Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, that's a couple hundred people in North America, and people who are at high risk for bleeding ulcers, people who have an advanced form of something called Barrett's esophagus, which can be a pre-malignant condition in the esophagus. It's very limited, but or very refractory reflux when everything else has failed. But again, these drugs are being given as first line, and there's a lot of legacy prescribing where somebody is given something, it doesn't really work, they add something else, but they don't stop the thing that wasn't working. So for 6 to 8, maybe even up to 12 weeks of use is considered safe. But I agree. I mean, the majority of people I see have been on these drugs long term, and my gastroenterology practice has shifted to really trying to sort of undo the damage. I call it the medical mischief, right? Of people who have been on long-term antibiotics, long-term proton pump inhibitors, long-term steroids. And it's an uphill battle. It is not easy to reverse the damage, because not only does it disrupt digestion, but PPIs create dysbiosis. And as we discussed earlier, dysbiosis is a foundation on which a lot of these other diseases are built. So in addition to having symptoms of SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, like motility problems and gas and so on, we can see autoimmune diseases developing. We can see diabetes developing, other things. And I think for the average person who's been given this drug by their physician, they're not necessarily going, oh, what does this have to do with it? The physician isn't even thinking that. So it's why one of the first things I do with new patients is I have them bring all their medication in. I'm like, bring it all. I want to see the supplements. I want to see the over-the-counter things. And sometimes it's surprising how many times people are on 2 different proton pump inhibitors. And they didn't even realize this is doing the same thing, but, double or quadruple. So it's really, for the gut, starting with taking a good look at the medicine cabinet is so essential.
Yeah, and doing it with your physician. And I really want to ensure that no one listening to this gets the wrong idea. It's not, again, I'll reiterate, it's not that these medications are bad. These medications serve very critical purposes when they're used judiciously. So it's not to be like, oh, I'm going to like throw all these away. No, you're going to go back to your physician and say, can we talk about why do I take this? Is there another alternative? Like, is there like actually in conversation, in collaboration with your physician, like go through these medications and see if this is the best course of action for you?
No, I'm so glad you added that. I do a free office hours, I call it, on Tuesdays at noon, where I discuss different topics, and it's a lot of fun, but I'm always reminding people throughout and at the beginning, at the end, this is not medical advice. I'm not your physician. This is for educational purposes only, but it's really giving people, I think, a framework to discuss this stuff. And the conversation should be just that. It should be a conversation, a dialogue. It shouldn't be a monologue of your doctor telling you what to do. It should be this, exchange of information. So yeah, hopefully this will give folks some talking points if they are on one of these drugs and they're concerned.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you like sort of an office hour easy question because
Sure.
something that does the rounds a lot in sort of like internet wellness spheres is the idea that a plant-based diet weakens your stomach acid. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, let me just answer that with a resounding no. That is not the case. No, not at all. And in fact, even this idea that like eating acidic foods, I mean, I tell people you have to let the symptoms be your guide. So if you suffer from acid reflux and you find that, coffee and orange juice in the morning doesn't sit well, which it very well may not, then those are things that you need to think about, cutting down on or maybe even eliminating. But people sometimes have the opposite thought and they think they should, be acidifying or alkalinizing, etc. But along those lines, particularly the green leafy vegetables are. I mean, we have study after study after study showing that they are helping to maintain the appropriate pH in our bodies. So, yeah, that one I can firmly say that's not correct.
Yeah. It comes from people who also pretend that vegetables aren't good for you. So the internet is its own wonderland of absolutely frustrating information. But yeah, I just wanted to get that from the physician herself. And so let's switch a little bit because, I feel like one of the main messages of this is that we have so much power and we have so much opportunity to make choices that, in particular, really shift our microbiome in a way that benefits like every single one of our systems. So let's talk about actually feeding your microbes. We've talked about fiber, and this is very much you and I are in lockstep on this one. But you also mentioned something to make it easy. It's like, how do we get more fiber? Because I think when people are trying to count things, they get very lost. And you talked about something in your book called your 1, 2, 3 rule, which I loved.
Yeah, my 1, 2, 3 rule has been around for a long time, although I've modified it, which I'll tell you about after I tell you about the rule. So the 1, 2, 3 rule is 1 vegetable at breakfast, 2 at lunch, and 3 at dinner. And if you add it up, that's 6 servings of vegetables a day. I changed it to make it 6 different vegetables after the data came out from the American Gut Project in 2018. And that was a fabulous study looking at over 10,000 people globally. And they found that the variety of plant foods people eat is one of the most important markers of a healthy microbiome. And so regardless of what label people call themselves, if they were eating 30 or more different plants per week, they tended to have a much healthier microbiome than 10 or fewer. Because I have a lot of patients, as I'm sure you do too, Desiree, who will say, oh, I'm a really good vegetable eater, but they're eating the same carrots, peas, and broccoli in heavy rotation, and that's all they're eating. And so the variety, and that study, just to be clear, was 30 different plant foods. So not necessarily vegetables, fruits, nuts, spices, herbs, all of them. And I like to just do the math for a bowl of oatmeal. You use maybe some almond milk, 1, the oats, 2, raisins, 3, pumpkin seeds, 4, walnuts, 5, blueberries, 6. I like to throw some shaved coconut on, that's 7. So that's 7 just in a
Yeah.
bowl of oatmeal. You can grab a carrot stick as you're walking out the door, or eat a little celery with some peanut butter. You get 2 if you're eating the celery, because you get the celery and the peanut butter. So there's so many ways, just throwing. I love to throw some fresh herbs on my salad, get some additional variety. So after that study came out, I told my patients, right, 1, 2, 3, 6 different. Can't all be the same. You got to mix it up. And I do focus on the vegetables because I find that particularly the green leafy vegetables, they're the most missing foods in the North American diet. So people are pretty good about eating nuts or using spice or herbs, but they're not always great about the green leafies. And my little trick is I flip it and I do 3 in the morning or more. I try to do a smoothie most mornings. This morning it's usually very green. This morning mine was purple because I did spinach and collards, which I had from the farmer's market. And then I did fresh mint. I did fresh parsley, but I used some wild berries instead of, and that changed the color. So normally I would do a little pineapple or mango or something, and it would still be pretty green, or some kiwi. And I try and get in about 30 to 40 ounces of that. And I tell you, that's my medicine. I do feel like that just sort of keeps things humming. And of course, it keeps things humming in the bathroom too, for regularity. There's nothing like blended up greens to really help you go.
Well, and it's, that just highlights, because I think we do get caught up, in that nutritionism, as you say, and
Yeah.
it's not easy. We are swimming upstream. When we attempt to take care of ourselves on a regular basis, we are actually swimming upstream. And yet it is remarkably simple. Like you just mentioned, like committing to a smoothie. You're like, I don't have a lot of time. And like, I can't cook like a big meal with all of these things in it for breakfast, but you've probably got 5 minutes. And it's really easy to throw handfuls of stuff into the blender and head out the door.
And as I used to say to my daughter when she was little, you don't have to like it. You just have to eat it. And here's the thing, there's plenty of stuff later in the day coming that I do love. Like there's almost always some dark chocolate, like every day. There might be some ice cream, but I make sure that I have built that foundation with the green smoothie and or a big salad or something, because I know how important that is, and that getting that in is more important than whether you have a little ice cream later on that day. By far, that's a more important part of that equation.
Well, and it's this idea that I repeat again and again and again, that what you put in your body is more important than when you take out, because you can be like a lectin-free, gluten-free vegan and not actually eat any vegetables, right?
Yes,
You're
I
like,
say
but
that all the
where
time.
are the vegetables?
Yes.
Okay. And although I have to admit, I'm going to flip-flop here, because I did say what is most important is what you put in. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk about a couple of things that tend to be less helpful, particularly for our gut immune axis. And one of the things you advise people to watch is their intake of added sugar. But then next, people thought, because people love sweets, like North Americans, we love our sweets. And so our next thought is usually to switch to non-caloric sweeteners, things like sucralose or stevia. Is that actually like a freebie for our microbiome? Or are
No,
we
that's a
doing
much worse
something?
idea. You're always better off going with real sugar. And what we found is that, some of the earlier iterations of non-nutritive sweeteners, commonly known as artificial sweeteners, were really problematic in the gut, like could turn fairly benign, healthy bacteria into more pathogenic bacteria that could penetrate the gut lining and cause all kinds of problems. What we see with things like stevia is not so much over dysbiosis, but the interference with communication between different microbial cells. So they are interfering with, and a lot of these communication pathways we're not even really aware of, right? It's like the trees communicate, but how do they do that? We don't know. So it does disrupt some of that signaling. And here's the thing, nothing is free. You can't get something for nothing. Maybe water. Water is free and a good idea. But yeah, and here's the thing too, for a lot of these non-nutritive sweeteners, it's important to remember that insulin is released in response to sweetness, not in response to calories. So if something tastes sweet, it's causing a release of insulin, which is causing not just calories to be stored as fat, if that's something that, for a lot of people are concerned about weight, but insulin also can create a lot of pro-inflammatory cascades if it's spiking and the levels are too high, and can cause a lot of dysregulation. So what a lot of studies have found is that these non-nutritive sweeteners, in addition to messing up your microbiome, causing a lot of bloating and gas, are also responsible for as much weight gain, if not more, than the regular sugar, and for, really creating dysregulation with these different inflammatory pathways. So really a terrible idea to use these artificial sweeteners.
Which is so helpful, because I think people are so terrified of carbs that, to hear that is groundbreaking. That of course, no health professional is going to say, flood your diet with sugar. But when it is that 20%, when you are having that occasional thing, it's better to have the real thing.
Of course, of course. And in terms of carbs, yeah, I mean, all this non-digestible plant fiber we've been talking about that's going to, set your immune system at the right level and keep your gut lining healthy and all the rest are carbohydrates.
Yeah.
They're all carbohydrates. But, Desiree, as you well know, not all carbs are created equal. And these unprocessed complex carbohydrates are very different from the processed carbohydrates, the sort of box foods that people, the baked goods, the pizza crust, et cetera, that people are eating. So really important to distinguish between those.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is alcohol, because one of the things that I find is that these very influential wellnessy folks on the internet, like they will talk about avoiding all hyper processed foods, or they'll talk about avoiding gluten, but you will regularly see them imbibing cocktails on a Friday night. And I find it an interesting, I mean, human beings are never rational, but I find it interesting what we deem worrisome or unhealthy and the things that we let slide under the radar. And, particularly in Canada, we've just released brand new national guidelines on alcohol that claim that anything more than 2 drinks a week, because it used to be seven for women, 14 for men, they
Yeah.
have clamped it down. Anything over 2 drinks a week is considered associated with increased health risk. So, what is your take on alcohol? Specifically with respect to our gut health.
When you go to get blood drawn, they take a little alcohol swab to clean your skin. That's to kill microbes. So alcohol is bactericidal. It kills bacteria. Before we had, other forms of things to sterilize parts of the body and so on in the operating room, they used alcohol. So there's no question that alcohol is really can remove large swaths of gut bacteria. But the question of how much of that you can tolerate really depends on what the rest of your health looks like. So if you're somebody who is maybe struggling with an autoimmune disease, has dysbiosis, has a lot of symptoms, alcohol probably does not have any room in your diet. There probably shouldn't be any room in your diet for alcohol, at least not at that time. If you're somebody who's overall really healthy, is eating well, and enjoys a couple drinks here and there, and is able to keep that in moderation, because that's the other thing that you see is alcohol is incredibly addictive, physiologically, mentally, emotionally addictive. Triggers there's dopamine receptors. And so we see for a lot of people the threshold for what would be considered sort of regular, sensible consumption really going up. So people are having not 2 drinks a week, but 2 drinks a day or more. And we know that at that rate, not only is it really problematic for the gut, but the rates of reproductive cancers, in women and men, the rates of GI cancers like pancreatic and esophageal and colon really increases dramatically. And so the thing I always try to let people know is to tell people, like, you have some choices here, the decision making, but I don't want you to be surprised. So I want you to understand that diseases like colon cancer, esophageal cancer, pancreatic cancer, these are not primarily genetic cancers. There are genetic forms of these cancers, but these are cancers that are primarily made, not born, through environmental factors. And so again, if you're a big meat eater and you also are not eating a lot of vegetables, and you are also pretty sedentary, and you are also under a lot of stress, and now you're drinking a lot of alcohol, you are really creating the foundation for disease to develop. And so, I never like to frame stuff like this is somebody's fault. Like, you shouldn't be surprised. You did this
Yeah.
to yourself. Not at all. But really to frame it the other way and say, you can undo this. There are things you can do to decrease your risk by changing your habits. So the amount of alcohol and whether you choose to have alcohol at all is really a personal decision based on what does the rest of your history look like, right? What's your soil look like in that sense? But I think, for anybody who's really struggling, and particularly if you're struggling with autoimmune disease or gut health problems, then you're definitely better off avoiding alcohol.
Thank you for that. I'm of a culture where daily drinking is normalized. It is a part of the culture. And so I find myself fascinated by always the impact and the influence of culture versus personal responsibility, and like how we make our choices, because it's so complicated. And for anyone listening to this, it can be easy to hear all this and immediately you're like, oh, all the things I'm doing are wrong. And it's so important to treat yourself with a measure of grace and patience, and realize that we're all just doing our best at any one time. And when we have the capacity to make change, we make the changes. And sometimes we don't. And to realize that we're all just like learning as much as we can, doing as much as we can. And if every day we do like a little thing to get closer to health, like that's such a fantastic thing.
I love that. And I'd also love to add to that the element of curiosity in addition to grace is that it's fine to experiment and to see. And so that might mean if you're drinking daily, to maybe cut back and drink just on the weekends or when you're out of the house. Or if you are thinking about becoming plant-based, to maybe say, okay, I'm only going to do one meal a day that has animal protein in it and see how that is. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And interestingly, the two biggest movements right now are the sort of sober curious movement and plant-based movements. And most of the people who are buying non-alcoholic liquor, if there's a bit of an oxymoron, but who are buying, who are sort of playing around with mocktails and buying stuff like Sea Lip and a lot of these non-alcoholic elixirs, are not people who are recovering alcoholics or teetotalers. They're people who drink, but they want to drink less alcohol. And the same thing in the plant-based world is a lot of the people who are looking into eating more plants are not vegans, but they want to eat more plants and they recognize the importance of that. And I really applaud that, the curiosity about it, like, let me try this and see how it feels. Let me try going to bed earlier and see how that feels. It doesn't mean like you, from then on in, you have to go to bed at 10 o'clock every night. But I think getting that feedback from your body by doing things a little bit differently. I remember when I started tracking my water, and I'll just take a little sip in honor of that from a big flask.
I have a similarly big one, but mine is not as cute as yours. It's very
Mine is heavy though.
yeah.
But when I started really paying attention to it and consistently getting in over 100 ounces of water a day, I mean, it was remarkable. It was like a drug. I was like, what?
Feels
I
so
was
good.
hurt, my skin, my body, yeah, it really was. And it's hard. It's hard to consistently get that in. I mean, I tell my patients minimum half your body weight in pounds and ounces of water, but that's as a minimum. And that's plain old water, not anything fancy, vitamin this, just plain old water. So start with that as a baseline and then add from there. But most people aren't getting that in. Most people are getting far less than that. And I'll tell you, I think a good percentage, maybe as high as 30% of all the problems I see in my GI practice, I think could be mostly solved by people drinking more water and eating more vegetables.
And if the idea of making a positive change in your health feels intimidating, there you have your next target. Can you drink water? Can you eat more vegetables? Remove all of the other noise and focus on that until it feels so solid, so habitual that you don't even have to think about it.
I love that. Yeah. Drink more water. Again, that half your body weight, whatever that is in pounds, half that amount in ounces, and commit to eating a salad every day, regardless of what else you eat.
Yeah. Love it. Okay. Let's switch to rapid fire now.
Right?
As always, we close with 5 rapid fire questions that my guest knows nothing about. And you mentioned this is actually perfect because you mentioned that you often choose a certain probiotic in your practice. What is that favorite probiotic for people to check out?
The probiotic is called Visbiome, Visbiome. And again, I use it as a medical food at a high dose. The prescription strength is 900 billion colony forming units. And so I use 4 of those packets, but that's not what I would recommend for the average person who's just trying to be healthy. That's in a specific situation of somebody, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, traveler's diarrhea, et cetera. But that is the one I use with a lot of data behind it.
I love that. So it's not for 100% of people, but
No.
if you have a condition you think need a probiotic, talk to your doc or your dietitian about Visbiome.
100% with
Perfect.
your practitioner. Yeah.
So I also know that you're an avid runner. What is your favorite place to run?
I am an avid but slow runner, and my
Me
favorite
too.
place to run, I can go far, but I cannot go fast. So I can outrun you, but I will not beat you because I will arrive hours later, but I can go far. My favorite place to run, two answers to that. One is Rock Creek Park, which is a beautiful national park that is literally right outside my house. My house is surrounded on 3 sides by it. And
Amazing.
every day I come downstairs, I'm like pinch myself that I live here surrounded by this beautiful park. And I was out there this morning. So I love running in Rock Creek Park. And then I love destination running for an errand. So if we're going to the movies, my husband and daughter will drive down and I'll run and meet them with my little backpack, and then I change. Or sometimes if I'm going to a friend's house for dinner, it kind of has to be a good friend to arrive a little bit stinky and sweaty. But I love that because it feels useful. You know, it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm just out here going out and back. It's like, I got to get there. And it's our anniversary coming up in a couple of weeks. And I told my husband that I want to do a walkabout. I said, I want to get our little backpacks and I want to run here, and then we'll do something, and then we're going to run there with a few changes of clothing. So I find that really exciting to be, you know, running to the bank or to the post office. But again, you usually have to have a little backpack to sort of, you know, get yourself presentable when you get there.
I love that. I think a lot of people here in Vancouver, bike commuting is really common. And I think there'd be an interesting paradigm shift to be like, why can't I run commute? Next one is, what is a not so immune friendly habit that you can't and will not give up?
Immune friendly, non-immune
Not so
friendly, or
immune,
not?
not so immune friendly. Something that maybe fits in your 20.
Yeah, chocolate. Chocolate. And you know, it's not immune unfriendly, depending
Flavonoids.
on how much you're having, but like no matter where I'm going to, I always pack some chocolate. Like I was in Dallas a couple days ago and I had the chocolate for going and the chocolate for coming back. And yeah, chocolate is, and you know, there's so many studies now about especially dark chocolate being healthy and so on. But that is, chocolate is forever for me.
I love that. I also travel with chocolate. It's like part of, you get your little toiletry kit together. You also like, where is my chocolate for the trip? That's funny. A supplement that people should definitely save their money on. They should pass.
Vitamin D, unless your levels have been documented to be low,
Mm.
because there is actually such a thing as vitamin D toxicity, and we see a fair amount of it. So by all means, get your vitamin D levels checked, particularly if you live in the Northern Hemisphere and you're not getting a lot of sun exposure year round. And if you have a subtherapeutic level, take some vitamin D, document that it's at a normal level, make sure it stays there. But I see so many people taking additional vitamin D and thinking the higher the level, the better, and really not. So vitamin D, if your levels are low, if your levels are normal, they don't need to be higher than normal. Just like if you're average size height, you don't gain any benefit by being extra tall. So that's one of those that I think we need to exercise some caution around. I mean, of course, you should make sure you're at a normal level, but don't try and get to those supra therapeutic levels.
Okay, so follow-up question to that. So here in Canada, it's notoriously difficult to get a vitamin D. Like your doc just won't order it. They're like, it's expensive. Everybody's deficient. Take vitamin D. In that case, what do you feel is like your conservative regular dose?
Well, it's not the 50,000 IUs a week
Oh,
that some people prescribe here, but if you're taking 2,000 IUs a day, that's a reasonable amount to take. Yeah. And, you know, I should be clear, like vitamin D is certainly not the worst thing out there. It's just that I think it's so overhyped. And
totally.
that's why, you know, I mentioned that one. I
Yeah.
think I mean, there's not a ton of evidence that a multivitamin does very much for us either, other than the fact that people who take vitamins often have healthier habits. So I always say, be the kind of person who takes the vitamin, but you don't necessarily need to take the vitamin.
I love that. Okay, last one. What are you watching right now? And if you do not have time to watch, is there an album or a song that you're really loving?
I am watching Dahmer on
Oh, are you?
Netflix because our daughter loves these. I mean, she's a wonderful person, and I don't see any inkling that she is going to be a serial killer, but she loves these serial killer things. And so I'm watching Dahmer, and it's really terrifying. It's terrifying because, like, who would have known, you know, that this person who was going to kill you and eat you was right there. So I've been watching Dahmer, and I am also watching Handmaid's Tale season 5, which I absolutely love. And I'm so struck by how real it is. I'm like, we're like a breath away from that if we're not careful on all kinds of levels, the extremism and so on. So I am watching season 5 of Handmaid's Tale, and song wise, this is terrible. I don't know who sings it, but Hotel.
Oh, I probably know that song to hear it, but I don't know
Yeah,
the
I know
title.
it from my daughter's
Okay.
playlist. Mine is old, but yeah.
I love that. Handmaid's Tale is still one of my top 10 favorite books I've ever read. And it was so interesting to me because Margaret Atwood talked about, because she wrote this in the 80s,
Yes.
that she's like, I did not use any material in that book that had not happened in our history already. And I do find it is jarring how prophetic it feels.
Completely, completely. Yeah, it's like a public service announcement from Margaret Atwood. Hello, be careful. This is what can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that book has recently been banned in a bunch of jurisdictions in the
In Canada?
US. No, no, not in
Oh,
Canada,
I
in the
was gonna say
US.
you are
Yeah.
much too sensible in Canada to ban anything Margaret Atwood has ever written. Yeah.
No, I feel like she is one of our, favorite daughters in this country for sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chutkan. There is
So
so much
welcome.
incredible information in this conversation. I just know so many people are going to learn so much. They should all absolutely pick up your incredible book, Antiviral Gut, which will, if you at all favor yourself a bit of a gut geek, this will literally blow your mind.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.